Hello everybody and welcome back to the free online woodworking school where we aim to take your woodworking skills to the next level. In today's video, we're going to begin sanding the cabinet. Let's get going. Sanding. Seriously, is a lesson really needed on sanding? Yes, it is not as simple as just scrubbing back and forth with your 120 grit, your 180 grit, and then your 240 grit, because if you do that aimlessly, you're going to make this thing look like a big old wooden cloud. If you watch the Dovetail box series, you're going to be pretty familiar with the principles I share in this video, but if you haven't watched the Dovetail box series and you're not aware of my approach to sanding, this video is hopefully going to be quite enlightening for you. And so throughout making this cabinet, we have tried very hard to keep all of these angles nice and crisp. The 45 degrees here, the front edges of it, that small chamfer we've got surrounding the drawer in order to give it that lovely shadow gap. The last thing we want to do at this point is round them off and make it look all fluffy. And look, I get it. Heavily rounded edges, sanded up to an incredibly high grit, feel amazing. I'm not disputing that. And if we were making children's toys, yes, absolutely, let's go for it. But in this case, all we need to do is just take off that sharp, splintery corner in order to make this thing feel nice to touch, but retain that lovely shape that we've been trying to preserve throughout the making of it. And there is no better way to lose that shape than getting a piece of sandpaper and just scrubbing away at it and then feeling how lovely those edges are. Yes, they feel lovely, but it looks terrible. And so to make this process easier, I'm going to completely disassemble the cabinet, top off, bottom off, back off, draw out everything in order to get better access to the internal parts of this and also these top corners and bottom corners, for example. Well, it's weird seeing it in bits like this. So the first thing I'm going to do is start random orbiting the large faces of the cabinet. And I want to highlight the fact I said large faces there. So that includes things like the bottom and top of the top and bottom plinths. The back panel is already sanded. I did that in a previous video. And also the external sides of the cabinet and the internal sides as well. Now again, the internals have already been sanded, so I only need to do those with about a 240 grit just to get rid of any grubbiness and finger marks and stuff like that. The outside, however, has not been addressed whatsoever, so we're going to be going through the usual stages of 120, 180 and then 240. Now when using a random orbit sander, it is incredibly important that you do not try and use it on faces like this. Not only because we've pre-finished the panel on the inside and you risk accidentally catching it, but a random orbit sander with a wide pad is going to slightly flex over that narrow face and end up causing a round over here and a round over on the inside, thus causing a scratch on that panel, and so you don't want to be using it there. Same again for the edges and the facets on the plinths. The front of the cabinet, you don't want to be using a random orbit on that, and obviously the top of the drawer. You could technically use it on the side of the drawer, but because I want to sand these in a very controlled manner, I'm going to be doing these by hand. And again, as a general rule when sanding, try and keep at least 2/3 of the pad on the piece of material at all times. If you go any further than that, the first risk is potentially rocking the sander and rounding off the edge, but also the flex in that pad will find it easier to flex over the edge and round it over anyway, even if you're pushing down flat on this surface here. This is the exact reason why it's not a good idea to try and use a wide random orbit sander on a thin edge like this, because it is just going to pillow over it and make it look like, as I said earlier, a big old wooden cloud. And so let's get all the faces that we can attack with the random orbit sander done first. I'm going to begin with the inside faces and get the 240 grit that are done straight away. If I did the outsides first and then started sanding the insides, I'm just going to get the outsides scratched up again on the bench below. So we might as well start here, get that done, and then we can just finish up these remaining faces afterward. And once we've completed this process on all the big faces, I will show you how to address all of the narrow faces around the cabinets and on the door and the drawer, etc. Right, so now let's move on to the drawer sides. Now obviously the drawer is fitting quite nicely at the moment and we want to take off a very minimal amount of material. In fact, we just want to get this face nice and smooth so that the drawer is more smooth when it's in use. Now for this I've opted for a hard block of sandpaper because with the soft one, again as I'm scrubbing it away, I don't want to accidentally roll over the chamfer we put on the edge and I don't want to start pillowing the edges here. And so this block has a nice flat hard face on it and I've rounded off the edges on it. If you don't round off the edges and you have the hard square edges like that, when you wrap sandpaper around it, you'll find that the 90-degree edges of the block leave like burnished track marks in it. Whereas if the sandpaper has a rounded corner to fold around, you're much less likely to get them. So hard hard block, rounded corners, and I'm going to start with 180 with this. It's smooth enough to not need any scrubbing with 120. And I also have some very small gaps that are present on the dovetails. You can see we've got one here, and there's a small one up this side of the tail as well. And so those are small enough to do the old dust and glue trick. A little bit of glue in there, sand over it, and that will be absolutely invisible. Anything larger than that, and you're probably going to need to start making shims to fill it instead. Right, so that's all the large flat faces sorted out, and now we need to start addressing the thin sides, including the front of the carcass and both sides of the door frame. And so starting with the door frame, I am going to mask off the pre-finished panel inside just to avoid scratching it, because I definitely will. And again, we're going for a hard block of sandpaper here. This is pretty nicely cleaned up, so I don't think I need to go to 120. I'm just going to go straight to 180 and then 240. So hard block of sandpaper, and I'm going to do very slow, deliberate strokes of this. I don't really want to scrub it back and forth because I know I'll end up rounding off the corners. So let's just going to place it on there. Just do strokes like that. Now obviously you've got parts here where you may accidentally sand across the grain. And so for that, I'm just making sure that the sanding block doesn't go beyond that join line. Okay, and then as for the rails, it's going to be difficult to stop before we hit the stiles. So get as close as you can. And then if it starts overlapping it whatsoever, we can blend in those scratch marks with light circular motions on the corner to basically imitate a random orbit sander, but without the disadvantage of it flexing and all that. So right up to the join. And then a few light circular strokes, and that will help blend in any cross-grain scratches. Right, so with the door sanded front and back, it's now time to start focusing our attention on the thin edges of the door and the rest of the carcass. And once again, for this part, I'm going to be using a hard sanding block. And you might be wondering by this point, well, if you're using a hard sanding block so much, what's the point in having a soft sanding block like this, or the equivalent being a cork sanding block, because on the cork ones there's a little bit of flex. Soft sanding blocks are perfect when sanding large flat surfaces like this, because it doesn't matter if it's not perfectly flat. And in fact, by having a hard sanding block, it can actually be detrimental, because if there was a little divot in here, that hard sanding block won't be able to get into it, whereas this would be able to flex according to those contours and sand the entire face nice and consistently. So it definitely has its uses, but a soft sanding block in cases like this is going to start rounding the corners, and we do not want that. Of course, we're going to be putting a little chamfer on there to take that sharp edge off, but we don't want it to be rounded. Right, so we're now working on the plinth section. On thin edges like this, you've got to be particularly careful because it's quite hard to find that location. I actually use my fingers underneath to act as a guide to ensure I'm not tipping. If you do that, then you've got too much weight on top and it'll be very easy to round it. So wrap them underneath and use them as a guide. Right, so pretty much everything is done by this point except from the carcass. Nothing new here, hard block, and just keep going. Right, so that's pretty much all the sanding done. So all the faces are sorted, the front face of the carcass is done. I went down the backs just now. Top and bottom plinth is done, door is done on the front and back and the sides, the drawer is also done. The only thing we've got to do now is start taking off those sharp edges. So when doing this, make sure you're aware of which faces you actually want to take the corner off. So for example, the front edges here, definitely. It's very likely people will interact with them and we want them to be nice to touch. This top corner here, do we want that to be taken off? No. No, you do not, because if you take off that sharp edge, when you put the top on, you're not going to be left with a nice join there. There's going to be like a weird shadow gap. The same goes for the back corners on the inside of the cabinet. You don't really want to round them off because you've got a back panel going in there, and by taking that off, you'll end up getting a gap there. And so you need to work out which areas are going to be interacted with by the user, while also making sure to avoid areas where you've got adjoining components. So the method I use to take corners off is pretty simple. You get some 180 grit wrapped around a block, and you stroke that up the edge once or twice. So that's taken the edge off, and it feels pretty damn good already. And so that's left us with a flat edge, and then a 45-degree chamfer on it. And I like to take those facets off just a little bit further to make sure it feels nice to touch. And I'll do that with a little bit of 240 grit, wrap it around your thumb, and literally just do one stroke up it, and that is it. And that'll leave you with an edge that is still beautifully crisp, feels amazing to touch, and of course, doesn't look overly rounded over. Just what we want. These internal edges are a little more difficult, but just go across like that once or twice, and then in the corners, because they didn't get a full stroke, just do short ones like that. Right, and there we go. That is how you sand with care and accuracy in order to achieve a beautiful result. So we've obviously got the handles fitted now, and so in the next video, we're finally slapping a finish on this thing. As always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do not forget to press the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time for finishing this cabinet.